Former Vice President Mike Pence testifying Thursday before the federal grand jury investigating efforts by then President Trump and his allies to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The information from the Associated Press, and they are citing sources. The testimony from Pence would be a milestone in the Justice Department's investigation and could give prosecutors a key first-person account about conversations and events leading up to the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. I want to talk more about all of this, so let's bring in Jonathan Adler, a law professor at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you so much for taking the time here to join us today.
Good to be here.
So first off, from a legal perspective here, can you help break down what led up to this testimony? Because this has been a lengthy process here.
It took months of legal wrangling before former Vice President Pence was willing to testify. And that's because the vice president has a distinct position in our form of government. The vice president is part of the executive branch as the president's running mate and has executive branch responsibilities. But the vice president is also the president of the Senate and has the ability to preside over the Senate. So viewers may have been familiar with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking tie votes in the Senate. And so there are two possible obstacles to a vice president being required to testify. One is executive privilege, and certainly former President Trump tried to prevent Pence's testimony on that basis, but also something that's called speech and debate clause privilege. The Constitution makes clear that members of the legislature, members of Congress, can't be prosecuted or called to testify based on their legislative actions. And so we had several months of legal wrangling over the contours of that privilege. Apparently, Vice President Pence happy with the court acknowledgement of speech and debate clause privilege, and the courts rejected former President Trump's claims of executive privilege. But it took several months to work all that out before Pence was willing to testify.
So as all of this was progressing here and developing over several months, was there any real question as to whether in the end here, former Vice President Pence would actually testify before that grand jury?
Well, before the speech and debate clause privilege question was resolved, the vice president was refusing to testify, and he had refused to testify before Congress. But 2 months ago, federal district court recognized that, at least as it applies to the vice president's actions presiding over the Senate and presiding over the vote count on January 6th, that he did have speech and debate clause privilege. And then the vice president said that once that was acknowledged, he was willing to testify about conversations he had with President Trump and things outside of his presiding over Congress. And so before that was resolved, though, he wasn't going to testify, and it wasn't clear he would be required to testify because speech and debate clause privilege is pretty absolute. It protects a member of Congress from doing things on the floor of Congress that would otherwise be illegal. It's a very strong constitutional protection. And so that had to be resolved by the courts before he was going to testify at all.
And you touched on this right there, but what exactly would Pence be required to actually testify about? Because as you mentioned, there are certain things that are quote unquote privileged.
Right. So based on what the vice president has said and our understanding of the relevant privilege questions, things related to the White House, related to his conversations with President Trump, his conversations with people like John Eastman or other folks that were advising President Trump and encouraging efforts to reject electoral votes, reject the election results, that he apparently was willing to testify about that. Vice President Pence said he was not going to invoke his own executive privilege on any of those questions. So our best guess is that during the 5+ hours he was being questioned yesterday, he talked about those sorts of conversations, the things that President Trump may have asked him to do, some of which Vice President Pence had covered in his in the memoir that he released. But anything about what happened in Congress was likely not discussed. And as often happens in these sorts of inquiries, the prosecutors probably probed the boundaries of that, and there was probably some time spent them trying to get as close to things that were privileged as possible, and him refusing to answer those sorts of questions. But most of the discussion would have been about things that occurred in the White House, things that occurred with the president and the president's advisors, not things that occurred in the Capitol.
Does it say anything about the case against Trump that they did have the former vice president testify, or is that something that you would expect to happen in a case like this?
Well, we've never had a case like this before, so I mean it's kind of hard to answer that question. I mean, Vice President Pence has said publicly that he did not witness anything that he believes was illegal. We know that the president was getting what I would certainly characterize as bad legal advice, or it was being encouraged to do things that would not have been lawful, and that the vice president refused to do those things. Certainly understanding the details of that, understanding what sorts of things were said and how they reflect Trump's state of mind, and whether or not that could be used to indicate kind of conscious efforts at wrongdoing, as opposed to him just pursuing his options and perhaps not understanding legal questions. Those are some of the things that we would expect to be looked at. And certainly the vice president's position in the White House would have given him a unique perspective on those questions. And any prosecutor would want as much information from someone in Pence's position as they could get.
And that's a very good point, because we never have had a case like this. Is there any way to tell what comes next in this whole process as this probe into former President Trump does continue?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know, because there are so many moving parts, and some of the issues that we believe are being investigated actually relate to some of the other cases involving January 6th that are currently in the courts. Some of the prosecutions and convictions that were obtained by the Justice Department are being appealed. They relate to some of the legal provisions or offenses that prosecutors have tried to prove. Some of the theories in some of the cases are a bit aggressive. And so what the next steps are may depend in part on what the appeals court makes of some of these prosecutions and how they interpret the relevant provisions. But the wheels for this sort of thing turn slowly. I don't think we should expect something dramatic to happen in the next few days, or even perhaps the next few weeks. Federal prosecutors in these sorts of complicated cases take their time to put pieces together, bit by bit. So, just because Pence testified yesterday, that doesn't mean we should expect some dramatic development next week.
All right, Jonathan Adler there. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and provide that feedback, perspective. I mean, obviously, this is a case, as you mentioned, like we haven't really seen before. Is there anything else that you want to add before I let you go?
Well, I mean, it's important that people understand that this is uncharted territory to some extent. The interactions of executive privilege and speech and debate clause privilege, the investigation of a former president, I mean, all of these things are things that thankfully we haven't had to think about too much. And that puts a lot of pressure on the legal system and forces courts to consider a lot of questions they've been able to avoid in the past. So we need to keep that in mind.
For sure. All right. Thanks again for taking the time here to join us.
My pleasure.